Welcome, University High School, to another edition of AP World History. And today we're going to be talking about, as soon as I can get this thing going, aspects of Greek life, the Persian Wars a little bit, but mainly we're going to be focusing on Greece and especially Athens. We're actually not going to get to Alexander in these notes. There'll be another set of notes to follow. So let's begin. We talked about the characteristics of a Greek polis or Greek city-state in our previous session, and just kind of like the characteristics of some of those cities. Like most of them had an acropolis, which was this fortified city hilltop. Open air marketplaces called agoras that were oftentimes gathering places for Greeks to meet. And most Greek city-states did not. They did not have standing armies. That is, they weren't, they didn't have like these paid soldiers that they had ready to fight at a moment's notice. Instead, the armies were usually made up by the average citizens, oftentimes by farmers, and they answered the call to fight whenever there was a threat. They had to usually make their own armor. These soldiers were pretty well trained, well equipped. They were called hoplites. They were a very formidable force. So, this brings us to the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was the biggest empire in the world at that time. They'd conquered under Cyrus and then under Cambyses and Darius most of the Middle East, like the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the Levant area, like the Phoenicians, Egypt, Anatolia, and in Anatolia, they'd conquered a group of Greeks, actually, in Ionia. So they were Greeks in Anatolia. A whole bunch of Greek city-states were established there because the Greeks actually established colonies throughout the Mediterranean. In Anatolia, in North Africa, and in other parts of the Mediterranean, because they were getting pretty crowded. There was not a lot of arable land in Greek, right? So here, these Greeks in Ionia are conquered by Darius. And tensions began actually by Cyrus, when Cyrus actually conquered Ionia and appointed these tyrants to rule those city-states. All sorts of tensions began then between the Greeks in Ionia and their Persian overlords, that eventually some Ionian city-states actually made an alliance with and gained the support of Athens, which really upset the Persian leaders. At the time it was Darius, and Darius decided to put an end to all of that and conquer all of southeastern Europe there, Greece. So that is where where like the growth of the Persian Empire actually begins to stall, because this force of Greek hoplites meets the Persians at Marathon. And they're made up mainly of Athenians. So what we see in red here on this map is the Persian army that eventually gets outflanked by this army of a much smaller army of Greek hoplites. They fight in this phalanx formation, by the way. And they defeated a Persian army that really, really outnumbered them at the Battle of Marathon. And that's where we get the name for the marathon, the race, because this was about 26 miles away from Athens. And Pheidippides, according to, I think, Robert Browning, ran from Marathon all the way to Athens to break this news to the Athenians. And when he got there, he shouted, "Nike," apparently, victory over the Persians. And then he dropped dead. 26 miles. All right, so the Persians are humiliated at this Battle of Marathon. It was a coalition of Greek city-states led by Athens that defeated the Persian army, which was the most powerful in the world at the time, which had the largest empire in the world. And Athens was just, this city-state that and its surrounding areas, and they were able to defend themselves from this army, which brings us to the Second Persian Wars, because Xerxes, who I think is Darius' son. Darius is descended In any case, sends the world's largest army against Athens in 480 BCE. That's 10 years later, right? To avenge his father's loss at the Battle of Marathon. So Athens gets busy to form some alliances, and that is the Hellenic League in 480 BCE. This alliance of city-states was actually led by Sparta, that defeated the Persians, and then the Delian League, 477 BCE, an alliance led by Athens that finally drove the Persians from Greece. The two famous battles in the Second Persian War are the Battle of Thermopylae. Thermopylae means like the hot gates, and the Battle of Salamis. Battle of Thermopylae is made famous or infamous, I suppose, in the movie 300 because we have from Herodotus, the father of history, right, an account of the Battle of Thermopylae that said that 300 Spartans defended themselves against like 3 million Persians or something ungodly like that. There was no way an army back then was even close to 1 million men. But still, the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae were greatly outnumbered, and they put up a very big fight, but eventually were overcome by the sheer numbers of the Persian army. And then the Battle of Salamis was a very famous naval battle, where the Athenian navy was victorious over the Persian navy. Athens' strength was found in its navy, and we'll talk about that in a minute here. So this alliance of Greek city-states, these two different alliances, is able to defend itself once again against the Persian Empire. This is very critical because you could say that the classical age in Europe, or in the Mediterranean, begins with this Greek golden age that's going to follow after the Persian Wars. And if they had fallen to Persia, things would have been very different, right? Here are some photographs that I took when I was at the British Museum in London. This is a helmet worn possibly by a Greek soldier, and we know how this guy died. Here, this comes from Herodotus, actually, the Persian Wars. Athena has not been able to soften the Lord of Olympus, though she has often prayed for him and urged him with excellent counsel. Yet once more I address you in the words firmer than adamant. When the foe shall have taken whatever the limit of sea crops holds within it, and all which divine blah 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 shelters, then far-seeing Zeus grants this to the prayers of Athene, which is Athens. Safe shall the wooden wall continue for you and your children. Holy Salamis, you shall destroy the offspring of women when men scatter the seed. So there's a lot of kind of like figurative language here. This wooden wall, what do you think it refers to? At Salamis by Athens. Guess it's their fleet of ships called triremes. They look like this. So Athenian power really rested in its strong navy. It was the strongest Greek city-state economically, and also because the Greeks used the sea as a highway. The sea was not a barrier for the Greeks. It was a very mountainous terrain, not a lot of arable land, pretty thin topsoil, so they relied on trade by the Mediterranean Sea, trading wine, olive oil, pottery, things like that. There's all sorts of evidence of Greek pottery, even going back to the Mycenaean and Minoan periods, found in Phoenicia and in Egypt. So these triremes are these 3-level oared ships. As you can see here, it look kind of like this. So Athens was able to control some really key points for commerce that gave it a lot of power among the Greek city-states because, well, if other cities are going to be using these ports, they're generally going to be having to pay some kind of taxes or a tribute. That is a very important term, tribute, that you need to know in this class because it's going to come up again and again. And it doesn't necessarily mean bowing one's knee before a king and paying tribute. No, tribute is actually like a financial sum, some kind of gift that is given by one to another as a payment, usually for protection or something like that. Okay, so after the Persian Wars, like I said, it ushers in this golden age for Athens, and the golden age really is led by this man, Pericles. So we know that Athens and ancient Greece, but especially Athens, is the birthplace of democracy. It's definitely not the kind of democracy that we have today. But it emerges. How and why? Well, the lower class people clearly gain military importance, right? So in these wars to defend themselves against this powerful empire, the Persians, obviously needed soldiers, and the soldiers are going to come from mostly the lower classes, and because of that, they're not going to necessarily want to remain in their low, poor situation. So democracy really develops out of necessity to please and to appease those lower classes. So it's limited at first, but it really expands into this guy Pericles. He was a demagogue, as it's called. It's kind of like this, I don't know, like he's a statesman that is unofficially the leader of Athens. So under his leadership, free landowning males were given the right to participate in the assembly. This was like the assembly of all citizens in Athens. You'd get together and you'd vote. Usually there's like this, everyone had a black stone and a white stone, and if you voted yes, you dropped in a white stone in this big pot, and if you voted no, you dropped a black stone in there. The Council of 500 was a more elite group. Also, they were also elected, and they were the ones that proposed the laws, and I suppose the assembly was the group that voted for them. And there was even a court system. They met, I don't know how often they met, but I think it was only a few times a year. This is, and you need to write this down, is direct democracy. Today, like in America and in most democratic countries in the world, it's not a direct democracy, but it's a representative democracy where we elect people to do this work for us. Here, it's a direct democracy. The citizens themselves did this. So this made Pericles popular, but also the money that was gained from commerce, with taxes, tribute from other city-states, just from that trade, it helped fund the construction of large building projects like this one, which doesn't exist, doesn't look like this anymore, but this is, if you said the temple to Athena, also known as the Parthenon, you'd be correct. And it was a massive, grand, beautiful temple, and it was up on the Acropolis, the hilltop, the fortified hilltop. So if you were in Athens and you looked up there, you're like, man, what a beautiful building. And who did you have to thank for that? Pericles, right? So once again, we see kind of like this connection and usefulness of monuments and buildings and architecture attributed to political figures as well, right? So somebody had to build this stuff, so the citizens are paid for this public work. It keeps them happy, and here is that same bust of Pericles with the bust of Gomen. This is also at the British Museum in London, so that's pretty rad. All right, let's continue with Athens and their golden age, because what else do we associate with ancient Greece but this cultural thriving? Philosophy, poetry, plays, theater, well, not so much poetry, but plays and theater, and of course mathematics and astronomy. So the big three philosophers, Socrates developed a certain method for coming to a knowledge of truth. And what do you think it's called? That's right, the Socratic method, or the interrogative method. Interrogative because you ask questions. It's a question and answer method to find the meaning of justice and wisdom, and so on and so forth. Almost everything we know about Socrates, we know from his student, because Socrates was kind of like a hippie of the 5th century BCE. He didn't write stuff down. He just kind of lounged around and philosophized and hung out with great minds and young people. He didn't write stuff down, but his student did. This fellow here. Who was his student? Plato. Well, first of all, yeah, his student is Plato, but Socrates was, his style was not very welcome to many of the leaders in Athens. They tried him, put him on trial for quote-unquote corrupting the youth of Athens, for putting their heads up in the sky and in the clouds so they don't, and they're not thinking about practical things and economic things. Instead, they're just sitting around and philosophizing, and they wanted him to essentially just kind of like say that he would stop doing this and go about his business and no longer bother the youth of Athens, or face death. But Socrates, and everyone thought he would just, quit philosophizing with the young people. A lot of people liked him, even his enemies, but he said no, and he points his hand in the air. The unexamined life, he said, is not worth living. and he took the death penalty by drinking hemlock, and he died. So we have Socrates' dialogues, and they're dialogues with other Athenian citizens that he has, where he's doing just that. He's asking questions, and they come to a truth, and then they question other aspects of that truth, and they continually build upon that. It's this question and answer method. And who wrote all this down? Plato did. He was Socrates' student that later founded this image that was painted much later on, about 2,000 years later, during the Renaissance, by this artist down here, one of the Ninja Turtles, Raphael. Plato's right in the middle there, and at this academy studied his famous student, walking with him there, Aristotle. Aristotle would have a big, all three of these guys, but especially Aristotle, would have a big influence on the development of thought in the Western world, in Western civilization. So we're going to be using that term from now on here when we're talking about Greece and Rome and Europe. We're going to be talking about the West pretty often. So he also founded a school called the Lyceum, which is a word for high school in French, a lycée. He wrote about politics, ethics, logic, rhetoric, just tons of stuff. By the way, Plato's most famous work, where he does record a lot of the dialogues of Socrates as well, is called The Republic. We're going to read a little excerpt from that later this week. So here's Socrates, there's Plato, and everyone is saying, no, don't do it. But he must, because the unexamined life is not worth living. Check out Greek architecture. Notice this stuff. What do you notice? There's columns, right? By the way, if this looks like the Parthenon and it's in really good shape, that's because it's kind of brand new. This is like a half-size or quarter-size replica of the Parthenon. And you know where this is? If you said Nashville, Tennessee, you're weird, but you're also correct. This is in Nashville, Tennessee. So next time you're in Nashville, go check out this little small replica of the Parthenon. So columns, we associate with Greek architecture. The simple one is called the Doric style, a little more fancy. You see the little rounded tops there, Ionic, and the one that's really fancy that has kind of like floral designs at the top is called Corinthian. Corinth was another very important Greek city-state. So we see this type of architecture all over the West especially, but then we're going to see it with the spread of Greek culture throughout parts of the Middle East, actually. We'll talk about that later on. Of course, here is the home of the President of the United States, the White House, with Greek columns and these triangular type facades. More art. Notice how the male and the female form are very, very idealized. All these come from the British Museum in London again. That is, they look very kind of perfect. Even Socrates, and if they probably, even though he was like oftentimes depicted old, he still got this chiseled body. That's because the Greeks really valued the form. They weren't so much interested in the physical world, but instead like perfections of forms, if that makes sense. And here's the British Museum itself in London, where all these things reside, and this itself looks very Greek, right? And what style is this? Did you already forget? This is Ionian, or Ionic, excuse me. All right, Athens wasn't perfect. Lots of plays came out of it, and these great philosophers and stuff like that. But lots of inequality too. So it was really, we could say, a democracy hypocrisy. Even though government moved towards democracy, especially under Pericles, only about 15% were able to vote. Women, slaves, foreigners, they had no citizens' rights. About a third of the population were actually slaves. Women were confined in Athens. They didn't really participate a lot in public life. They were kind of treated like minors, if you will. In Sparta, however, that is an exception. Women had quite a bit more freedom. They were able to speak out. They had to be these strong-willed women that raised essentially soldier-like men. And bisexuality was actually pretty common in Athens. So how is Sparta different from Athens? Well, first of all, it is very Spartan. That's like an idiom in the English language today. Look up what Spartan means. So it kind of usually means like tough, bare, simple, rugged. So it was a very militaristic type society. Boys began training at age 7. So for about 20-something years, they were training nonstop. And this was very hard training. So they weren't the artists or the poets or something like that you might find in Athens. Citizens were forbidden from commerce. Most of them were farmers. Girls also received physical training and education, and a lot of the toughest physical work was done by this social class known as the Helots. They were a conquered people by the Spartans. The Helots or the Helots, they held the lowest social position and they did the hardest labor. Almost done here. So we got the Persian Wars. They're able to fend off the advances, military advances from the Persian Empire, and then ushers in this Athenian Golden Age. But Athens is clearly the dominant city-state economically, and it's clear that they're using their leadership during the Persian Wars now to their advantage, and just through like the taxes that they charge from some of the other city-states to use ports and to engage in commerce, it leads to a lot of resentment from some of the other Greek city-states. So much so that eventually a war breaks out between Athens and Sparta, along with many of their allies. So this is a war between Athens and their allies and Sparta and their allies. And it's not a war that lasts for 1 year in 431. No. The reason this war is so devastating and that we're actually studying it is because it lasted for decades. I think up to almost 30 years. And that is very, very bad because it weakens all of the Greek city-states, all of this fighting. Sparta wins, and they actually gain some support from the Persians. Go figure. So this fighting among the Greek city-states really weakens them, and it creates this power vacuum, if you will, that is going to be filled by whom? What Greek people from the north? If you said Macedonians, you'd be correct. Macedonia is a country today. They are not Greek people today. And in fact, Greece, the country Greece, hates the fact that Macedonia took that name, and they won't even acknowledge them in the UN or in the EU, I forget, because Macedonia today is not the Macedonia of back then. Macedonia here in the 5th century BCE, they're Greeks. They're Greeks, okay? So some cultural differences, but essentially they're Greeks. So they can, this guy, King Philip of Macedonia, is able to gain control of these city-states through by creating a confederacy. It's kind of like an alliance. That's what a confederacy means. Confederacy of Corinth. By the way, where does this word Peloponnesian, which looks funny, where does it even come from? Well, this peninsula right here that Sparta is on, that's the Peloponnese. This is the Peloponnese Peninsula. So that's why it's called the Peloponnesian War. Here's Athens. This region around here is called Attica, and that's the region that Athens controlled. Anyway, check this out. Check out this map before we move on. The Persian Empire, this is Anatolia, right? Turkey. The satrapy of Sardis. So these are the various satrapies that the Persian Empire was split into. Those provinces, right? And each province had this governor that was responsible for collecting taxes and so on and so forth. Okay, so this happens. King Philip of Macedon, and we will stop there. The Greeks are united under him, and a whole Greek. By the way, a big effect of the Persian Wars is that it creates a Greek identity. Prior to the Persian Wars, all Greeks felt like they were Athenian or Spartan, and so on and so forth, and that does continue to an extent, but they also they banded together in that war, right? And so a Greek identity among all of them sort of develops, and that is key moving forward into the next period led by Alexander the Great, but we will stop there for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Come back next time.